He first noticed her on a Tuesday, curled up on the one thing in his yard that was as broken as he felt. It wasn't a grand discovery. There was no sudden gasp, no moment of cinematic revelation. It was just a quiet acknowledgement. A slow, tired blink from the kitchen window. His hand wrapped around a coffee mug that was still warm, but felt cold anyway. The world outside was painted in shades of gray and damp earth. A late autumn chill had settled deep into the bones of the neighborhood, the kind that promised a bitter winter was coming. Rain wasn't falling, not yet, but the air was heavy with the thought of it. You could smell it, that clean metallic scent of damp concrete and wet leaves turning to mush on the ground. His house was quiet, an unnerving, hollow kind of quiet that had become his constant companion for the last 11 months. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of presence, the absence of a soft humming from the other room, the sound of pages turning in a book, the gentle clink of a teaspoon against a ceramic mug. The house used to breathe. Now it just existed, a container for memories he tried not to touch. And there, in the middle of the overgrown lawn, was this little cat. She was a calico, a messy patchwork of sunset orange, deep black, and bone white. Scruffy, like she'd been put together with leftover pieces of other better-loved cats. Her fur was clumped in places, and one ear had a tiny, jagged tear at the tip. She wasn't sleeping on the patch of dry grass near the fence, or tucked under the relative shelter of the overgrown rose bushes Eleanor had loved so much. No, she was curled in a tight, protective ball, directly on top of the little wooden bird. The bird was a garden ornament, something Eleanor had bought at a flea market years ago. It had once been perched on a stake, its painted blue wings spread as if in mid-flight. But the stake had rotted through last spring, and the bird had fallen. One of its delicate wings had snapped clean off. He'd meant to fix it. He'd meant to do a lot of things. But time had a way of slipping through his fingers like fine sand, and the bird just lay there in the grass, a forgotten casualty of neglect. Broken. And this tiny stray creature had sought it out, chosen it. She slept with her small head resting on its one good wing, as if it were a pillow made just for her. He watched her for a long time that morning, the coffee growing bitter in his cup. He didn't feel pity, not at first. He didn't feel much of anything. He was just an observer. It was easier that way. Observing didn't require effort. It didn't require you to open any doors, literal or metaphorical. He watched her chest rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. Even from this distance, through the smudged glass of the window, he could see the vulnerability in the curve of her spine. She was completely lost to the world, trusting this broken little patch of his yard to keep her safe. It was a foolish kind of trust. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and went about his day. The day was a series of quiet, joyless rituals. Wiping down counters that were already clean. Checking a mailbox that was usually empty, save for bills and junk mail. Sitting in his armchair, the one opposite hers, and staring at the wall. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe sometimes. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, he looked out the window again. She was gone. The broken bird lay alone in the grass, looking even more pathetic in the fading light. He felt a strange, hollow pang in his chest. He told himself it was relief. Strays were trouble. Strays carried diseases, fleas, and a hunger you could never truly satisfy. It was better this way. But the next morning, she was back, in the exact same spot. Curled around the same broken bird, her fur beaded with morning dew, shimmering like tiny diamonds in the weak sunlight. This time, he noticed something else. A few feet away, nestled in the grass, was a small plastic army man. It was one of his sons, probably lost 30 years ago, unearthed by a frost heave or a digging squirrel. The little soldier was missing an arm, its plastic rifle snapped at the barrel. It was another piece of forgotten, broken history. The cat had ignored it. She had walked right past it, seemingly, and chosen the bird. He found himself thinking about it all day. It was a stupid thing to fixate on. A cat, a broken toy. But his mind, so often a blank, quiet space, now had something to turn over and Examine. A small, insignificant puzzle. Why the bird? Why the deliberate choice of something so obviously fractured? It was a question with no answer, and that somehow was a comfort. The big questions in his life, the ones about fairness and love and what you're supposed to do with all the years you have left when the person you were going to spend them with is gone, those were too heavy. They crushed him. But this was a small, light question. It was manageable. A week passed. The routine became his new normal. Wake up, make coffee, look out the window. There she would be, a little knot of life in his dead garden, clinging to that broken bird. And every evening she would vanish, only to reappear with the dawn. He started to see her as a reflection, a kindred spirit in brokenness. He was a man whose life had snapped in two. His heart was a thing with a missing wing. He didn't know how to fly anymore either. Maybe that's what she saw in the bird. Maybe she understood. It was a ridiculous thought, projecting his own grief onto a stray animal. He knew it was, but the thought took root anyway. Then, one Monday, something changed. It had rained hard overnight, a cold, driving rain that rattled the windows and made the whole world outside look like a watercolor painting left out in a storm. He woke up with a familiar ache in his chest, the kind that always came with the rain. Rainy days were for staying inside, for reading side by side, for the smell of soup simmering on the stove. The memory was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. He forced himself to the kitchen, his feet shuffling on the cold linoleum. He expected the yard to be empty. No sane creature would be out in this. But she was there. Soaked. Her fur was plastered to her tiny frame, making her look impossibly small and fragile. She wasn't curled up on the bird. The puddle around it was too deep. She was sitting beside it, shivering, her body trembling with a violence that made his own hands feel unsteady. She was just enduring it, staring straight ahead at nothing, taking the lashing rain without complaint. But she hadn't abandoned her spot. She hadn't left the broken bird. He stood at the window, frozen. A war was raging inside him. The part of him that was hollowed out and tired, the part that just wanted to be left alone, screamed at him to turn away. It's not your problem. Don't get involved. Caring was a risk. Caring meant opening yourself up to more pain. He knew that better than anyone. But another part of him, a part he thought had died with Eleanor, stirred. It was a faint, flickering ember of something that felt dangerously like compassion. He saw the way her little body shook, and he felt the echo of it in his own. He thought of all the nights he'd sat in the dark, feeling the cold seep into his bones, just enduring the storm inside his own head. He didn't know her. He didn't know her story. But in that moment, he felt like he understood her language. It was a language of quiet suffering, of loyalty to something shattered. Before he could talk himself out of it, he opened the back door. The squeak of the hinges was unnaturally loud in the morning quiet, a sound of protest. A rush of cold, damp air filled the kitchen. The cat's head snapped up. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, locked onto his. They weren't wild or feral. They were just ancient, filled with a deep, weary caution. He didn't move. He just stood there, holding the door open, letting the warmth from his lonely house spill out into the rain-soaked world. An invitation. He didn't call to her, didn't make a sound. He just waited, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Her body was still trembling, but her gaze was unwavering. It was a silent negotiation, a question hanging in the air between them. He could see the conflict in her, the instinct to flee warring with the desperate need for shelter. Slowly, deliberately, she took one step, then another. Her paws made no sound on the wet grass. She moved with a strange, broken grace, as if every movement cost her something. She didn't run for the shelter of the door. Instead, she walked over to the broken bird, nudged it once with her nose, a final, tender acknowledgement. Then, and only then, did she turn and walk towards him. She stopped at the threshold, just outside the reach of the door, and looked up at him one last time. Her green eyes weren't asking for permission anymore. They were just seeing him, really seeing him, and in that moment he knew. This wasn't just a cat seeking shelter from the rain. This was something else. Something had begun. And the quiet, empty rooms of his house would never feel the same again. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're listening alone tonight, know I made this story for you. Subscribe if you want more comfort like this. She stood on the precipice of his world, a tiny, drenched creature caught between the relentless storm behind her and the vast, unknown quiet ahead. Water dripped from the tip of her nose, a steady, rhythmic plink onto the worn linoleum of his kitchen floor. Each drop seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the house. Her body was a tightly coiled spring of uncertainty. One wrong move from him, one sound too loud, one breath too sharp, and she would vanish back into the gray blur of the rain. Arthur didn't move. He barely breathed. He made himself small in the doorway, a quiet, unassuming mountain, trying to communicate with his stillness that he was not a threat. He was just a harbor. A temporary one, if that's all she needed. After a long, unblinking moment, she took another tentative step, crossing the threshold completely. Her paws, cold and wet, made no sound. She was a ghost of a cat. She didn't venture further into the kitchen, but huddled by the door, as if to keep her escape route clear. She shook her head once, sending a fine spray of rainwater arcing through the air. And then she began the meticulous process of grooming. Licking a paw, wiping it over her ear, her movements jerky and efficient. A small act of reclaiming dignity in the face of the storm. He knew this was his cue to retreat. To give her the space she was silently demanding. He backed away slowly, his socked feet whispering on the floor. He closed the kitchen door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the warmth. He went into the living room and sank into his armchair, the worn leather sighing under his weight. His heart was hammering against his ribs. It was a foreign feeling. For so long, his heart had just existed. A metronome, ticking away the seconds of his empty life. Now it was alive with a strange, anxious energy. There was another living thing in his house. A heartbeat that wasn't his own. The responsibility of it felt immense, terrifying. What did you do with a stray cat? He had no idea. Eleanor had been the animal person. She was the one who kept birdseed in the garage for the sparrows. The one who would gently catch spiders in a glass and release them outside. They'd had a cat once, a long time ago when their son was small. A big, lazy ginger cat named Marmalade, but that was a lifetime ago. The memory was hazy, coated in the dust of years. Food. She would need food. He pushed himself out of the chair and went back to the kitchen, opening the door with a loud, deliberate creak to announce his arrival. She was still by the back door, but she had stopped grooming. She was watching the door, her green eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. He avoided looking at her directly, a trick he remembered reading somewhere. He busied himself with opening the pantry. It was mostly cans, soup for one, beans for one, and there, on the back of the top shelf, behind a box of stale crackers, was a small can of tuna in oil. Eleanor had bought it. For emergency sandwiches, she'd said. He'd never touched it. His hands trembled as he worked the can opener. The metallic grating sound was like a scream in the quiet room. The cat flinched but held her ground. The familiar fishy smell filled the air. He spooned the tuna onto a small saucer, part of a set they'd gotten for their wedding, and placed it on the floor, a good 10 feet away from her. Then he filled a small bowl with water and set it beside the saucer. He retreated again, watching from the living room doorway. She didn't move for a long time. She just watched the food, then watched him, her little head turning back and forth. It was a standoff, a test of patience. Finally, he realized she wouldn't eat with him there. She wouldn't let her guard down. He sighed and went back to his armchair. He picked up a book from the side table but didn't read it. He just stared at the pages, listening. He heard it after a few minutes. A faint, rhythmic crunching. A small, secret smile touched his lips. It was the first time he'd smiled in, he couldn't remember how long. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. A delicate dance of advance and retreat. The little calico, who he had started to think of simply as visitor, made the small utility room off the kitchen her domain. He left the back door propped open just a crack, enough for her to come and go as she pleased. And she did. She was a creature of two worlds. She would appear in the morning for her saucer of tuna, eat it quickly and silently, and then vanish for hours out into the cold, fading autumn. Sometimes he would see her from the window, back in her old spot. She would sit beside the broken wooden bird, not sleeping on it anymore, but just keeping it company, as if she were standing vigil. He didn't understand it. She had warmth now. She had food. A soft rug he'd put down for her in the utility room. And yet she was still drawn to this symbol of her old, broken life. It was a loyalty that baffled him. He learned her language, the subtle dialect of a creature who had survived on caution. He learned that the slow blink of her green eyes was a sign of trust, a gesture of peace. He learned that the slight twitch of her ear meant she was listening to every sound he made, cataloging it, deciding if it was safe. He learned that she would only drink her water after he had walked away from the bowl and was in another room. She never made a sound, no meows, no purrs. She was a silent, watchful presence, a tiny shadow flitting at the edges of his life. And her presence began to change the house. Or maybe it began to change him. The silence was no longer a suffocating void. It was an expectant quiet. He found himself listening for the soft thump of her paws landing on the doormat, for the whisper-faint sound of her slipping through the crack in the door. He started talking to her, in a low, rumbling voice he hadn't used in months. "There, you are," he'd murmur as he spooned out her food in the morning. "The world is still out there, is it?" She would just watch him, her gaze intense, unreadable. "Cold today," he'd say, looking out the window. "Frost on the lawn. Be careful out there." He felt foolish, talking to a cat who never answered back. But the words filled the air, pushing back against the emptiness. He was speaking them for himself, he knew, just to hear a voice in the house again. One afternoon, he was sitting in his armchair, a wave of grief washing over him so suddenly and so fiercely it stole his breath. It happened like that sometimes. A stray thought, a scent, the way the light fell across Eleanor's empty chair, and it was like he was back in that sterile white hospital room, holding her hand as it grew cold in his. His chest ached with the sheer physical weight of her absence. Tears pricked at his eyes, hot and shameful. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He didn't know how long he sat there, lost, in the storm of his own memory. But when he finally looked up, his eyes blurry and red, she was there. She was sitting in the doorway of the living room, perfectly still, watching him. She wasn't asking for food. It wasn't her time. She was just there, bearing witness to his sorrow. Her quiet presence didn't fix anything. It didn't take away the pain. But it tethered him. It was an anchor in the storm, a small living thing that saw him in his brokenness and didn't run away. He looked at her, this little stray who had come in from the rain, and a question bloomed in his heart, quiet and profound. "Do you think they know when we need them most?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she gave him a slow, deliberate blink. He blinked back. It was a conversation without words, an understanding that passed between two lonely souls in a quiet room. Winter began to tighten its grip on the world outside. The frost on the lawn became a permanent, crystalline blanket. The metallic tang of the cold air was sharp in his throat each morning when he opened the door for her. He started to worry when she was gone for long stretches, his eyes constantly scanning the yard for a glimpse of her patchwork fur. She continued her strange ritual with the broken things. One day, she left a new treasure on the doormat for him to find. It was a single, gray feather, beautiful and perfect, except that the central quill was snapped cleanly in two. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the break. Another day, it was a shard of a blue glass bottle, its sharp edges worn smooth by time, but a visible crack running through its center. She never brought him anything whole. Never a perfect leaf or an unlucky field mouse. Only the damaged, the discarded, the broken. It was her calling card, her offering. He kept the items in a small wooden box on the mantelpiece next to a picture of Eleanor, his collection of mysteries. The space between them began to shrink, millimeter by millimeter, day by day. She started to eat while he was still in the room, though she would keep her back to him, her small body still tense. She would sometimes linger in the kitchen after her meal, finding a sliver of weak winter sunlight on the floor and washing her face, a sign of contentment he treasured. One evening, he built a fire in the hearth. It was something he and Eleanor used to do every night in the winter. He hadn't had the heart to do it since she was gone. But the cold had seeped into the house, a damp, penetrating chill that felt like it came from the inside out. He knelt on the hearth, stacking the kindling, his movements slow and rusty. The flare of the match was loud in the quiet room. The kindling caught, and soon a small, cheerful fire was crackling, casting flickering orange shadows on the walls. The warmth felt like a blessing. He sank back into his armchair, closing his eyes, letting the heat soak into his tired bones. He must have dozed off. When he woke, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was bathed in a soft, warm light. He felt a presence. He opened his eyes. She wasn't in the doorway. She wasn't across the room. She was right there, on the rug beside his chair. No more than a foot away. It was the closest she had ever been to him of her own free will. She was curled into a perfect circle, her tail tucked over her nose, fast asleep in the radiant warmth of the dying fire. His breath caught in his throat. He sat perfectly still, terrified of waking her, of breaking the spell. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her flank, the soft flutter of her whiskers as she dreamed. She looked so peaceful, so completely at home. He sat like that for over an hour, a living statue, guarding her sleep. The house was silent, save for the soft crackle of the embers and the sound of his own steady breathing. The ache in his chest was still there. It was always there. But tonight, it felt softer, less sharp. Finally, her eyes fluttered open. She lifted her head, her green eyes adjusting to the dim light. She saw him watching her. He expected her to startle, to leap up and retreat to her safe distance. But she didn't. She just looked at him, and then she uncurled herself, stretched her front legs out with a small, luxurious yawn, her tiny pink mouth a perfect O. He didn't move. He didn't dare. He just kept his hand resting on the arm of the chair, palm down, the way it had been when he'd fallen asleep. She stood up, arched her back in a long, graceful stretch, and then she started to walk past his chair, heading for the kitchen. But as she passed, she did something that made his heart stop. She altered her course by a fraction of an inch, just enough for her body to press against his dangling hand. It was the faintest touch, the soft, warm whisper of her fur brushing against his knuckles, followed by the feather-light flick of her tail against his wrist. It lasted only a second, and then she was gone, a shadow melting into the darkness of the next room. He sat there, in the firelight, staring at his hand. He could still feel the warmth of her, a phantom touch that sent a jolt right through him. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice, a deliberate, fleeting gesture of trust, a fragile bridge built across the vast, silent space that had separated them. He lifted his hand and looked at his own skin, as if he expected to see a mark there. There was nothing, of course, but he knew, deep in the broken, quiet places of his heart, that something had just been healed. The touch became their new language, a silent, secret dialect spoken in the quiet moments of the day. It was never demanding, never overt. It was a soft brush of her flank against his leg as he stood at the sink, a fleeting weight on his foot as she passed by his chair. Sometimes, when he sat by the fire, reading a book he'd read a dozen times before, she would leap onto the armchair opposite his, Eleanor's chair, and curl up, her presence a warm counterpoint to his solitude. She was there, but she was still her own creature, a visitor with her own laws and her own history. He decided in the quiet of his own mind to call her Willow, for the way she bent without breaking, for the quiet, graceful resilience she carried in her small frame. Winter settled in, deep and unforgiving. The world outside his window became a stark etching of black branches against a white sky. The house, once his prison of grief, had become a sanctuary. The two of them, Arthur and Willow, were quiet castaways on a small, warm island, waiting for the seasons to turn. The rhythm of their days was as soft and steady as a sleeping heartbeat. Food in the morning, the shared silence of the afternoon, the warmth of the fire at night. He had started to believe this was it, that this quiet companionship was the shape of his life now. He had allowed himself to feel a fragile, tentative kind of peace. He had stopped expecting kindness from the world, and yet it had shown up at his door, drenched and shivering. But Willow had not forgotten her old life. She had not abandoned her strange loyalties. Though she spent her nights in the warmth of the house, her days were still her own. And on those days, when the sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, he would see her from the window, sitting in the snow beside the one-winged wooden bird, which was now capped with a small hat of white. She would just sit, a little patchwork statue, her gaze fixed on the frozen lawn, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, and the gifts continued. But they began to change. They grew more specific, more intimate. It was as if she were learning the geography of his own brokenness and bringing him pieces of it. One morning, he found a dried, cracked maple leaf on the mat. It was from the tree in the front yard, the one he and Eleanor had planted on their 10th anniversary. The same tree that had a deep, dark crack in its trunk from a lightning strike years ago. He had always seen that crack as a scar they had both survived together. Willow had brought him a leaf from that tree, a perfect broken thing from his own story. The mystery of her, which had been a gentle curiosity, began to sharpen into something more profound. It wasn't just a quirk anymore. It felt like a message he didn't know how to read. The real shift came on a Saturday. He'd needed a screwdriver from his old workshop in the basement. He hadn't been down there in almost a year. The workshop had been his place, a small, subterranean world of wood shavings, soldering flux, and the quiet satisfaction of making things whole. He had been a clockmaker by trade, a mender of time. But after Eleanor passed, the idea of fixing anything felt like a lie. So he had closed the door and locked it, leaving his own stopped clocks to gather dust. The air in the basement was cold and still, thick with the scent of sawdust, turpentine, and forgotten things. Dust motes danced like frantic fairies in the single beam of light from the high, grimy window. His workbench stood against the far wall, a graveyard of unfinished projects. A beautiful mantel clock, its gears laid out in a complex, gleaming puzzle that he'd stopped working on the day she got her diagnosis. A set of small, carved animals for a grandchild he would now never have. A little wooden box, the lid half carved with an intricate pattern of ivy that he was making for Eleanor's jewelry. The chisel had slipped on his last attempt, splintering the delicate vine. He'd never touched it again. He found the screwdriver and turned to leave, his chest tight. The place was a monument to his failures, to a life that had been interrupted. He didn't pull the door entirely shut on his way out, leaving it ajar by an inch. He didn't even notice. Later that afternoon, he realized he hadn't seen Willow for a few hours. This was normal, but a small anxious flutter started in his chest anyway. He called her name, his voice soft and hesitant. "Willow?" No response. He checked the utility room. He peered out the back door. Nothing. He walked through the quiet house, a growing dread coiling in his stomach. Have you ever felt a connection so quiet? You were terrified the slightest noise would break it. That's how he felt. This fragile piece was so new, so precious. He was certain it could be shattered at any moment. He was heading back to the living room when he heard it. A tiny sound from the basement stairs, a soft scratching. His blood ran cold. He rushed to the door and pulled it open. And there she was. She was sitting on the third step down, looking up at him. And at her feet was a small wooden gear, no bigger than a quarter. One of its teeth was chipped. It was from the mantel clock on his workbench. He stared at her, then at the gear. His mind struggled to make sense of it. She had found his sanctuary of broken things, his tomb. And she had brought him a piece of it. She hadn't chewed it, hadn't treated it like a toy. She had carried it carefully up the stairs and presented it to him. An offering. He slowly knelt down, his old knees protesting. She didn't. Back away. He picked up the gear, the familiar shape of it a strange comfort in his hand. He looked at her, and her green eyes were wide, her expression unblinking. intense. It was the look of someone trying desperately to communicate something. Vital, without the words to do so. He left the basement door open after that. It became her new place. Her secret garden. He would find her down there, curled up asleep, not on a soft pile of rags, but on the splintered lid of the jewelry box. Or nestled amongst the disassembled parts of a pocket watch whose mainspring had snapped. She sought out his failures, his abandoned projects, and she slept on them. She sanctified them with her presence, treating these fractured objects with a reverence that shook him to his core. His worry for her grew into a quiet, aching obsession. Who was she? Where had she come from, carrying this profound sorrow, this affinity for the broken? He started watching her when she was outside, tracking her movements. She never wandered far. She stayed within the confines of his yard, and the one next door, which belonged to a young family. And that's when a new, more alarming pattern began. She started to disappear. At first, it was for a full day. He woke up one morning, and she wasn't there. Her food sat untouched. He waited all day, his anxiety a hard knot in his gut. The silence of the house was loud again, mocking him. He was a fool to have let himself care. Of course she would leave. She was a wild thing, not his to keep. She returned just after dusk, slipping through the crack in the door like a shadow. She looked exhausted, her fur matted in a way that wasn't from rain or snow. He knelt down, and for the first time she let him run a hand down her back. Her spine felt sharp beneath his fingers. She was thinner. She ate ravenously, then drank a whole bowl of water before collapsing on the rug by the fire, falling into a sleep so deep it seemed almost lifeless. A week later, she was gone for 2 days. The worry he felt this time was a physical sickness. He couldn't eat. He couldn't read. He just paced the rooms of his house, stopping at every window, scanning the empty, snow-covered yard. He went out and walked the perimeter of his property, calling her name until his throat was raw, his voice sounding thin and pathetic against the vast winter silence. He felt the cold dread of loss creeping back in, a familiar poison. He had just gotten used to a new kind of quiet, a peaceful quiet, and now the old, terrible emptiness was threatening to swallow him whole again. On the evening of the second day, she came back. She was in a worse state than before. There was a fresh, angry-looking scratch over her left eye, and she was limping, favoring her front right paw. She didn't go for her food right away. She just stood in the middle of the kitchen looking up at him, her body trembling with a fatigue that seemed to go down to the bone. He knelt, his heart breaking. "Willow," he whispered. "Where do you go? What is happening to you?" She just looked at him with those ancient, knowing eyes, as if the answers were all there. If only he were smart enough to understand. This became the new pattern. A few days of peace, of recovery, where she would stay close, regaining her strength, letting him brush her fur, sleeping by his side, and then the strange compulsion would take her again. She would grow restless, pacing by the back door, her silent gaze fixed on something beyond his yard, and then she would be gone. Each time she returned, she was a little more worn, a little more diminished. It was a mission, a pilgrimage that was costing her everything. He felt helpless. He was losing her, piece by piece. This fragile connection, this one living thing that had anchored him back to the world, was being worn away by a mystery he couldn't solve. The breaking point came in the first week of March. A false spring had teased the world with a few days of sun, melting most of the snow. Then, a brutal cold snap returned, freezing the damp ground into a solid, unforgiving sheet of iron. Willow had been gone for 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights. He had given up hope. He was sitting in his armchair, staring into a dead, cold fireplace, the house a mausoleum once more. He had failed her. He had let her in, yes, but he hadn't been able to protect her from whatever haunted her out in the cold world. The grief he felt was sharp and new, a terrible echo of the loss that had defined his life. He finally understood. Love wasn't a fortress. It was just a place to stand and watch the things you care about get hurt. The clock on the mantelpiece, a whole one that worked, ticked loudly, each second a small hammer blow against the silence. He had resigned himself to it. She was gone. Then he heard it. Not a thump, not a scratch. A sound at the back door so faint it was more a feeling than a noise. He shot out of his chair, his heart leaping into his throat. He fumbled with the lock and pulled the door open. She was there. But she fell, more than walked, over the threshold. She was caked in mud, and her fur was wet, but not from rain. It was as if she'd crawled through a frozen ditch. Her limp was pronounced, and the scratch over her eye had reopened. She was a tiny, battered soldier returning from a war she had lost. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid of how fragile she felt. "Oh, Willow," he breathed, the words catching in his throat. But this time was different. She didn't go to the food bowl. She didn't head for the warmth of the fire. She looked right up at him, her body trembling, her breathing shallow and fast. Her green eyes, usually so full of weary caution, were now blazing with a desperate, frantic urgency. And then, for the very first time since he had known her, she opened her mouth and made a sound meant for him. It wasn't a meow, it wasn't a purr. It was a soft, guttural chirp, an urgent, questioning sound. "Meow?" She made the sound again, louder this time, and took a painful, limping step back towards the door. She looked at him, then at the dark yard behind her, and then back at him. There was no mistaking it. It was a summons. She wasn't just telling him about her pain. She was telling him to come. She was telling him he had to follow. There was no thought, no decision. The urgent, questioning chirp from that tiny, battered creature sliced through his paralysis and went straight into the core of him. It was a sound that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the part of a soul that knows when another is in desperate need. It was the most honest sound he had heard in a year. He didn't grab his good coat. He didn't stop to put on proper shoes. He snatched the heavy-duty flashlight from the hook by the door and pulled on the thin gardening jacket that was hanging there, shoving his bare feet into a pair of old, cracked leather slip-ons. The cold was an immediate, violent shock, but he barely registered it. Willow was waiting for him on the top step of the porch, her small body silhouetted against the weak, ambient light of the street. She chirped again, a sound sharper this time, a frantic, "Are you coming?" And then she turned and half-limped, half-stumbled down the steps and onto the frozen lawn. He followed. The night was achingly clear and cold. The stars were hard, distant diamonds scattered on black velvet. There was no moon. The air was so frigid it felt sharp in his lungs, each breath a painful intake of tiny, invisible needles. His feet screamed in protest as the frozen, iron-hard ground stole every bit of warmth from them. The beam from his flashlight cut a nervous, bouncing circle of light on the ground ahead, illuminating blades of grass frozen into crystalline spears. She led the way, a small, determined shadow moving through the darkness. Her limp was agonizing to watch. Every few feet, she would stop and look back, her green eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, two tiny, frantic emeralds in the night. She was making sure he was still there. She was trusting him to follow her into her secret world, into the heart of her pain. And the weight of that trust was a heavy, sacred thing on his shoulders. He had expected her to lead him into the woods behind his house, or down the street into some forgotten alley. But she didn't. She turned and limped directly towards the fence that separated his property from his neighbor's. It was a low, chain-link fence, and she slipped through a gap near the bottom with a pained grunt, a sound that tore at him. He had to walk to the gate, his fingers fumbling with the frozen latch, the metallic click echoing loudly in the profound silence. The neighbor's yard was a landscape of a life he no longer knew. A child's plastic tricycle lay on its side, a eye, dusting of frost on its bright red seat. A swing set stood like a lonely skeleton, its chains creaking softly in a breeze he couldn't feel. It was a place of laughter and play, and it felt alien to him now. Willow was waiting for him on the other side of the gate, her breath coming in visible, shallow puffs. She led him past the swing set, her paws making soft, crunching sounds on the frozen earth. Her destination was the large wooden deck attached to the back of the neighbor's house. It was dark and imposing, and the space beneath it was a black, impenetrable void. She stopped at the edge of the lattice that skirted the base of the deck. A small section of it had been broken, leaving a jagged hole just big enough for a small animal to squeeze through. This was it. This was the place her secret journeys had led her. She looked up at him, one last pleading look, and then she disappeared into the darkness. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He got down on his knees, the cold and dampness of the ground seeping instantly through his thin trousers. He aimed the flashlight at the hole. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing a cramped, dusty space. The smell of cold earth and something else, something faintly sweet and sad, drifted out. He had to lie on his stomach to see properly. The frozen ground bit into his elbows and his chest. He pushed the flashlight ahead of him, the beam sweeping across the underside of the deck. He saw old leaves, a forgotten tennis ball, cobwebs, thick as cotton. And then the beam found her. She was huddled in the farthest corner, next to one of the thick wooden support posts. She was curled protectively around a small, makeshift nest. It was fashioned from dried leaves, scraps of insulation, and a few pieces of a tattered blue tarp. His first thought was relief. She has a safe place, he thought. A den. But then the light moved, and he saw what was in the nest. And the world, his entire world, tilted on its axis. It took his mind a moment to process what his eyes were seeing. The image was so profoundly, terribly wrong. There, nestled in the pathetic collection of leaves and debris, were 3 kittens. They were impossibly tiny, no bigger than his thumb, their fur still bearing the downy softness of birth. One was a calico, a perfect miniature of its mother. One was pure black, a little spot of midnight. The third was orange and white. They were perfectly still. Their tiny bodies were curled as if in sleep, but it was a sleep too deep, too permanent. A stillness that screamed its wrongness to the heavens. The brutal, unforgiving cold snap had come, and their small new flames had not been strong enough to withstand it. They had simply gone out. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs in a single, silent gasp. His breath hitched, and a sound, a raw, wounded thing, got stuck in his throat. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was only this vast, hollow cavern of sorrow that had opened up inside him. The flashlight beam trembled, shaking violently in his hand. He struggled to hold it steady, and the light slid past the kittens and illuminated the rest of the nest. And that's when he saw them. The toys. Lying there, tucked carefully amongst the still forms of her babies, was a small, curated collection of broken things. There was the armless plastic soldier from his own yard. There was a small, cracked teacup from a child's tea set. There was a little rubber mouse with one of its felt ears torn off. He stared, and the pieces of the puzzle, the pieces he had been collecting and wondering about for months, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The broken bird, the snapped feather, the chipped gear, the splintered box. He finally understood. The shocking, heartbreaking truth of it washed over him, and he began to tremble. His hands, his arms, his whole body shook with the force of a grief that wasn't just his own. She wasn't drawn to broken things because she herself was broken. She was a mother. A desperate, loving mother who had been trying to build a world for her children. She had been bringing them toys. The only toys she could find. She had been bringing her babies gifts, the most precious things she could find in her world. The beautiful, the discarded, the forgotten, the broken. Her long absences, her exhaustion, the weight she'd lost. She had been trying to hunt for them, trying to keep them fed, trying to keep them warm against an impossible, brutal cold, all while her own small body was failing. The gee-gee, sobs he had been holding back finally broke free. A deep, ragged sound tore from his chest. He pressed his forehead against the frozen dirt, and the tears came, hot and silent, freezing on his cheeks. He cried for the tiny, innocent lives that had never had a chance. He cried for the small, fierce mother who had fought and failed. He cried for Eleanor, for the child they had lost, for the grandchild they would never hold. He cried for every broken, beautiful, and hopeless thing in the world. He lay there, shaking in the dirt, a broken old man crying beneath a stranger's deck, his sorrow a raw, open wound. He felt a small movement beside his head. He lifted his tear-streaked face. Willow had left her nest. She had limped across the cold, hard dirt and was now standing beside him. She looked from his face to the still forms of her kittens, and then back to his face. Her green eyes were bottomless pools of a grief he now understood perfectly. There were no barriers between them anymore, no species, just two souls who knew the shape of loss. He held his breath, expecting her to retreat, to guard her tragic secret. But she didn't. She took one more painful step forward, and then she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She pushed her head firmly into his trembling, outstretched hand. She leaned into him, her small body a solid, warm weight against his palm. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't seeking comfort for herself. She was offering it to him. It was a gesture of profound, shocking grace. A silent acknowledgement. You see, you understand my heart. And I, yours. He carefully, slowly, curled his fingers, stroking the soft fur behind her torn ear. She didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, a low, ragged sound rumbling in her chest. It wasn't a purr of contentment. It was a purr of sorrow, a shared lament in the cold, dark earth. He stayed there with her for a long time, the two of them kneeling in the darkness before a tiny, sacred grave. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the tragic scene, a heartbreaking pietà of a mother and her lost children. And in that terrible, holy moment of understanding, he saw the truth. All this time, he thought she had been showing him the world's brokenness. He thought she was a reflection of his own shattered life. But he had been wrong. She wasn't a mirror of his grief. She was a teacher. He finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. She hadn't been showing him what was broken in the world. She had been showing him what was still worth loving, even when it was gone. The world under the deck was a frozen, silent tableau of a tragedy too profound for words. Arthur lay on the cold ground, the flashlight beam a solitary, holy spotlight, and for a timeless moment, he and Willow were just two living creatures adrift in a shared, bottomless ocean of grief. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, but he couldn't feel it. All he could feel was the warm, solid pressure of her head against his hand, an anchor in the swells of sorrow. But anchors are not meant to keep you at the bottom. They are meant to hold you steady until the storm passes. Slowly, as if waking from a long and terrible dream, he knew what he had to do. He could not leave them here in the cold, dark earth under a stranger's house. Their short, brief lives, and their mother's fierce, desperate love, deserved more. They deserved a place of honor, a place of peace. He withdrew his hand from Willow's head, and she made a soft, questioning noise in her throat. "It's all right," he whispered, his own voice sounding cracked and foreign. "It's all right. We're going to take them home." He backed out from under the deck slowly, his limbs stiff and clumsy. He stood up, his knees popping in protest, and looked at the little broken hole in the lattice. Willow appeared in the opening, her green eyes watching him, questioning him. She trusted him, but she did not yet understand. He walked back to his own house, his movements quiet and deliberate. He didn't rush. This was a ceremony now, a ritual that had to be performed with reverence. He left the back door open and went straight to the basement, down into his dusty, silent workshop. His eyes scanned the shelves, the cluttered workbench, the graveyard of his own unfinished life. He wasn't looking for just any container. It had to be the right one. And then he saw it, the little wooden box he had been carving for Eleanor, the one with the half-finished ivy pattern on the lid, the one he'd abandoned when the chisel slipped, splintering the delicate vine. It was his own most personal, broken thing, a symbol of a love interrupted. It was perfect. He picked it up, blowing a year's worth of dust from its surface. He ran his thumb over the splintered wood, a wound, just like the tear in Willow's ear, just like the crack in his own heart. He took a small piece of sandpaper from his bench. He didn't try to fix the flaw, didn't try to erase the mistake. He just gently, lovingly, sanded the sharp, splintered edges until they were smooth to the touch. He wasn't mending the break, he was making it safe to hold. He took the box and an old, soft flannel shirt, one of his favorites, worn thin at the elbows, and returned to the neighbors. yard. Willow was waiting for him, a small, patient shadow by the hole. She watched as he once again got down on the frozen ground. "I'm just going to make them comfortable," he murmured, as much for himself as for her. He reached into the darkness, his hands guided by memory. With a tenderness he didn't know he still possessed, he lined the splintered box with the soft flannel. Then, one by one, he gently lifted the tiny, cold forms of the kittens and laid them inside. He placed the black one, the calico, and the little orange one side by side, as if they were only sleeping. And then, he gathered their treasures, the armless soldier, the cracked teacup, the one-eared mouse, and placed them in the box with them. A mother's love, a mother's gifts for their journey into the long quiet. He slid the box out from under the deck and carefully placed the lid on top, his thumb brushing over the smoothed-out scar in the wood. Willow came out of the darkness and walked over to the box. She sniffed it once, her whiskers brushing the lid. She looked up at him, and in her gaze there was a deep, sorrowful understanding. She knew. He carried the small, precious casket back to his own yard, Willow limping silently beside him. He didn't have to think about where to go. There was only one place. He went to the spot where the one-winged wooden bird lay in the grass. This was where their story had begun. This was where he first saw her, curled up on a broken thing, a silent testament to a grief he couldn't comprehend. Now, it would be a memorial. He got a spade from the garage. The frozen ground was hard as stone, and every shovelful was a monumental effort. He worked steadily, his breath pluming in the cold air, his sweat freezing on his brow. He was no longer just digging a hole. He was carving out a space for memory, a place for peace to take root. When it was deep enough, he placed the box gently at the bottom. He stood for a moment, his head bowed. He didn't know any prayers, not anymore. But he offered up a silent thanks. For the tiny lives that had shone so briefly, and for the fierce mother who had taught him the true meaning of love. He filled the hole, the dark, rich earth covering the wooden box, and then he gently placed the one-winged bird on top of the freshly turned soil. A guardian, a marker, a promise that they would not be forgotten. Willow sat and watched the entire time, a silent, dignified mourner. When he was finished, she walked over to the spot, sniffed the disturbed earth, and then looked up at him and gave him a slow, deliberate blink. "Thank you." And then, for the first time, she turned her back on the broken bird and walked with him, side by side, back into the warmth of the house. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, nothing was the same. The change wasn't loud. It was a slow, gentle sunrise after a long, dark night. The house no longer felt empty. It felt calm. The silence was no longer a void, but a peaceful, shared space between two souls who had seen the worst of each other's pain and had not turned away. Willow never left for long again. Her frantic, desperate journeys were over. Her purpose was no longer out there in the cold world. It was here, with him. She still went outside, exploring the yard, sitting in the weak afternoon sun. But she never went farther than the fence. She was home, and she began to heal. Her limp faded, her fur grew back thick and glossy, and the haunted, weary look in her eyes was replaced by a soft, steady calm. One evening, about a week after the burial, she was curled on his lap as he sat by the fire. He was stroking her back, his hand moving in a slow, rhythmic motion, and he felt a deep vibration start in her chest. It grew into a powerful, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the whole room. A purr. A real, genuine, soul-deep purr of contentment, of safety, of love. The sound was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. And he closed his eyes, tears of gratitude slipping from beneath his lids. He started healing too. A few weeks later, he found himself standing at the door to his workshop. He opened it, and this time, he walked in not to retrieve something, but just to be there. He ran a hand over his old tools, the familiar feel of the worn wooden handles, a comfort in his palm. He looked at the half-finished clock, the disassembled watch, the carved animals. They were not monuments to his failure anymore. They were just waiting. He picked up the one-winged wooden bird from the small grave in the yard and brought it inside. He sat at his workbench, and with a surgeon's care, he mended the broken wing. He didn't try to hide the seam. He let the fine line of glue show, a delicate silver scar. Because he had learned that it is the breaks, the scars, that tell the truest stories. When he was done, he placed it not in the yard, but on the mantelpiece, where it could watch over their quiet, peaceful lives. He had started to mend time again. The last of the winter frost finally thawed, giving way to the tender, hopeful green of spring. Life, stubborn and beautiful, returned. The crocuses Eleanor had planted years ago pushed their way through the soil, splashes of purple and yellow against the brown earth. Arthur felt the shift inside himself, too. The mornings felt lighter, the nights less heavy. He would wake up to the soft weight of Willow sleeping on the foot of his bed, a steady, warm presence that chased the shadows away. He began to work in his garden again, pulling weeds, turning the soil, preparing the earth for new growth. He felt Eleanor's presence there, not as a painful absence, but as a gentle, loving memory. One bright April morning, he was in his workshop, sanding the smooth, curved back of one of the little wooden animals. Willow was with him, as she always was, dozing on a soft pile of rags on the corner of the bench. The door was open to the yard, letting in the fresh, damp scent of spring air and the sound of birdsong. Suddenly, Willow lifted her head, her ears perked. She stretched, hopped off the bench, and trotted purposefully out into the garden. Arthur smiled and went back to his work. The rhythmic rasp of the sandpaper, a meditative sound. A few minutes later, she returned. She hopped back onto the workbench, making a soft, chirping sound to get his attention. She had something in her mouth. She walked over to him, her expression serious, and gently deposited her offering into his open, calloused palm. He looked down. It wasn't a broken twig. It wasn't a snapped feather. It wasn't a cracked stone. It was a flower, a single, perfect, purple pansy, its face a velvety jewel of deep indigo and bright yellow. It was still beaded with morning dew. He recognized it instantly. It was from the patch near the back fence, the ones Eleanor had always called her thinking flowers. It was whole. It was alive. It was beautiful. He looked from the perfect flower in his hand to the little cat who had brought it to him. She looked back at him, her green eyes clear and full of a quiet, certain love, and she gave him one long, slow blink. In that moment, he understood the final gift. The cycle was complete. She was no longer bringing him symbols of what had been lost. She was bringing him proof of what could grow back. He had taken her broken heart and given it a safe place to heal. And she, in return, had taken his and planted a garden in it. He learned in the end that the deepest wounds aren't the ones that break us apart, but the ones that break us open. Open enough to let another soul in. Open enough to begin again. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.